Hello, welcome to Dissident Canada. My name is Tyler. As predicted on the Friday episode of Dissident Canada, there are a whole bunch of people trying to spur more war in Ukraine. Yay. What they can do to keep that going remains to be seen, but expect them to keep that going because they have no off ramp. They have not given themselves a way to weasel out. So just expect them to double, triple, and quadruple down. What they've been doing for what, 3 years now? Almost four. So that's whatever. Um, on to today's topic. I want to talk about something I have repeatedly talked about with increasing importance, and that is Mark Carney at the helm of Canada while going through an economic disaster. And the first thing we should point out that yes, there is some form of economic reckoning seems to be building in the back end. When it happens, again, it's hard to tell. My best guess at this point would be sometime next year is when you start to get the downslide of say the the Dow or the S&P 500, where you have like 3 or 4 weeks of extended, oh, it hit a new low, oh, it's just red, it's red, it's red, it's red. um, I suspect we'll have a lot of weeks of red, by the way. um, but that's neither here nor there. It's just that's what's building in the back. We're starting to get, you know, economic data that is like, oh yeah, that no, that is recession territory. You're starting to see jobs, layoffs, um, inflation data, as well as at the beginning of a recession it spikes and then it dramatically drops off and then levels off. At least if we're comparing it to 2008, which is the only real recession we can compare to, because that is what when the euro dollar system kind of completely, well, not completely, but it broke in such a way that previous recessions have no fundamental bearing. Like, you can't really have 1970s recession, you can't have what happened in the 80s, you can't have 1930s. You can't have the flash crash of 1907. Mechanically, it's very different set of back end plumbing of what's going on. So, what everybody should be very terrified is that Mark Carney is a banker, and not just a banker. He's a central banker, and has been for like a central banker for what was it? It's like almost 10 years, and then prior to that, working at Goldman Sachs, so an investment banker. So he sees the world fundamentally differently than everybody else. He sees, down times, recessions, depressions, as very differently than your average human. He sees it very differently than a politician. And why that should really terrify you is he's doing nothing. And I mean nothing. Like, just think of the last couple weeks. What has Mark Carney substantively done? Now, I know Parliament is out of session for a while now, but they haven't done anything. Like, he hasn't, like, he's flown all over the world. That's fine and dandy. I think I understand what's going on there. He's setting up the potential of deals for when shit hits the fan. Hasn't really engaged with Trump in trade negotiations, which should be fairly up there. Isn't doing, like, he had, what is it, Bill? Is it C6 this time round? Or C4? Maybe C6? Maybe C5? the bill that was granting him the powers to just ram any type of nation building project that could benefit Canada through. Hasn't done anything. There's been talks, but nothing's been done so far, which again should scare people because when central bankers aren't doing anything, they they know something's wrong. They just don't know what to do. Now, I don't think Carney doesn't know what to do. I think he knows what's coming. And as I have said before, I think he is planning to let the drop be blamed on Trump. Set it up in such a way that Trump and the tariffs are going to get the blame. All right? Just say, Trump's unreasonable. We came to him. We wanted to make a deal, blah, blah, blah. These tariffs not only hurt the Canadian economy, they hurt the American economy. You can see, look at the stock market. And from there, at least with the boomer cons and the overreactive cons in this country, will have quite a bit of leeway to do stuff. And I think that the stuff he will do is basically gut any chance of sovereignty or autonomy in Canada. He may get a slightly more favorable deal with America. Maybe we'll see what happens because Donald Trump is going to be under immense pressure, and I've gone over that. But where I think things will be interesting is that again, Mark Carney only sees things for the most part through balance sheets, assets, liabilities. How do we balance this? How do we, juice numbers to make it look okay? How do we, what shenanigans do we pull to, make GDP go positive? That's where it gets worrisome because, as I pointed out, I think on the Friday video, the easy, or not, I didn't point out, but I got the validation that the easiest way to juice GDP numbers is to import a whole host of immigrants, use them as basically indentured servitude or slave labor, and you get economic activity. Now it creates economic distortions. The way we record GDP, it looks positive, in reality, it's very negative. But you get this false positive, things don't look so bad, even though the people are suffering. You've got this disconnect of reality. You've got this 1984 of, the party telling you, oh no, this is good, but your reality is something completely different. There's that issue that's likely to come up. But there's also the likelihood, all right, that in the next, say, 6 to 12 months, the likelihood that the Ukraine war is in end stages, where they're just doing final mop up and that type of just finalizing where everything is. Like the Ukrainians don't have much left. The Russians are projecting that their amount of spending that they need to do on the military will go back to normal by, let's say, the end of this year, which would suggest that they're preparing for, again, winding down the SMO. Whether or not that happens, I don't think so, but the reason I bring that up is that crushes the Europeans' dream of using Russia as the new Africa for a form of wealth extraction, using the indigenous population as basically an indentured servitude slave labor force in which they can extract wealth and become fabulously rich. This is why Hillary Clinton has such an axe to grind with Russia and specifically Putin. She was promised that if during the Maidan coup, that when that kicked off and they would have full war with Russia, the proxy war, the Russians would collapse and she would become a multi-billionaire. So she's a little pissy about that. Um, but Europe needs somewhere, like the globalist stronghold in Europe needs somewhere to extract wealth. They're running into problems with Africa, with African nations, A, standing up for themselves, and B, China coming in. So that wealth extraction well is nearing an end. They need a new one. Where is the most likely place? Well, it's somewhere they already own. That's Canada, especially with Mark Carney in charge. So, um, I see Mark Carney as Canada, as I predicted before, runs into a sovereign wealth, or not sovereign wealth, sovereign debt crisis, because last time round, say 2008, Canada didn't run into the same sovereign wealth crisis or sovereign debt crisis that the European countries up in for multiple reasons, but mostly our deficits were not as bad. So the risk ratio of foreign banks owning a couple of Canadian bonds, like in the a couple hundred millions on balance sheet that are a couple trillion, didn't really affect them. It was just we'll do this because we can. But now you're looking at um, total deficit each year is going to be successive years now is going to be around 100 billion, if not more. Um, which means now, instead of uh, having foreign banks and domestic banks gobble up, a few $1 billion worth of debt, it's substantially more. So, and with banks being very iffy now on Canada and foreign investment being very iffy on Canada, the likelihood that the geopolitical risk that they are willing to take on Canada is the same that it is now. So you'll see a spike in yields. Um, I don't know how high they would spike, but I would say there will likely be a significant spike. So the question is, if you're going to have a financing problem with government, how do you finance it? Well, that's where Mark Carney as a central banker comes in. Assets and liabilities. What does Canada have a lot of asset wise? Resources. That's where Europe comes in. He'll likely sell them off for relatively close to pennies on the dollar. All right. And then, as a labor force, you either have in the mass migration that will continue, all right, or you will offload what's happening in Europe to Canada and use them as the labor force. This won't profit Canadians to the same extent that it should, and it's going to cause problems. This is but one likely scenario. This is what I fear. All right, this is the issue. Is like everything in Canada gets worse, and Canada's already primed so bad, and then you want to add in, you know, a 2008 scenario with mass migration and foreigners getting all this money and offloading, say more millions of immigrants. It's going to get nasty. And, again, I've walked you through how I see this. It's because Carney's doing nothing. All right? When a system that is biased towards doing something, government or a central bank, they've always typically got something going on. When they are biased towards action of some kind due to political pressure, when they are doing nothing, is the time to be scared, because they have a scheme in place and they want to see. Like, and they're just going to let it happen. Now, this is but one scheme that Carney could have. You could come up with like a couple dozen others at the least. Some worse, some better, but generally that's the scope of what's going to happen in my opinion, in all likelihood. Um, but if Carney continues to do nothing, like he doesn't do the wealth extraction, he doesn't do the mass migration, that I think that's even worse. Maybe or maybe not. Maybe he's just, setting up a scenario in which um, Canadians beg Trump to take over, and that's what's actually going on. I don't believe that, because then we'd have to believe that Mark Carney is working with Donald Trump. And Carney's kind of like low level globalist nobility at this point, and the globalist power factions hate Donald Trump. Absolutely hate him. So I don't see them working together to. Plus, again, Trump taking over any part of Canada works in his disfavor, because the kind of people that you are either getting um, a high propensity of, like, the equivalent of coastal liberal elites. So think California leftists or New York leftists, or you are getting New York or California conservatives. Um, and if you understand how evil the Republican Party is in California, that's not good. You're thinking of former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and the atrocities and evil that he has helped bring into the world, or someone like John McCain. That's basically the majority of Canadians right there. That's your spectrum. You have a small spectrum of MAGA equivalent in Canada, but the majority of people and how they would vote would be those two extremes. So for Donald Trump to adopt Canada as even just, a territory like American Samoa, or say Puerto Rico, where, hey, you're American, but you're semi-autonomous. You don't get all the rights of Canada, but you don't have to pay federal taxes. Or did I say Canada there? You don't get all the rights of being an American, but you are an American, but you don't get statehood. Um, would be very bad, because you would see a flood of those Canadians dispersed across America. You really would want to open that floodgate. You'd much rather have a longer lasting deal where you have a military base up in the Arctic, and you get trade agreements, you get maybe some pipelines, you get some mineral extraction deal done, which again, it's preferable to deal with the United States than anywhere else, um, just due to, like, the philosophy of the countries. America may not live up to its lofty ideals, but it at least tries to. Um, Whereas everywhere else, it's but a veneer. So again, worried about Carney is very much at the top of my mind, especially as I look at more and more data showing, oh, this is not good, or just open up the U.S. Treasury yield curve and see, oh, yep, now we're still solidly inverted. That's not fun. That's not great. So that'll be the video today. See you tomorrow with something. Until then, have a good day.